In the first of the talks that I did for Nottingham University, I tried to set out the existential challenges that we're going to have to face if we want to survive as a species. Nowhere is this going to be more challenging than in the concept of our food policies, because to stay within manageable limits of climate upheaval, effectively in the industrial world, we're going to have to cut our carbon emissions by at least 10% per year, every year, throughout the rest of this decade and probably the decade that follows. And that's a huge challenge. So we need to address it sector by sector in terms of what this means. And probably the most important starting point is in relation to food. What does it mean in terms of our food policies? And what does it mean in terms of the diet and the way in which we approach not just the production of food, but also its distribution? The business as usual case, the current obsession with trade agreements that national politicians seem to be caught up in, actually is a real busted flush already. This business as usual case just makes it abundantly clear that across this century, we're going to very rapidly hit peak everything apart from pollution. And we're going to see declines in output of food, and in the increases in industrial production are all going to plummet. Even population is going to plummet. So the question then is, if this model is taking us towards that sort of precipice, what are the alternatives? And the good news is that there are really exciting things that are happening at locality levels all around the planet, some at a country level, some at a city or community level. And we need to somehow all engage with those to bring them into the realities of our own approaches, whether it's a locality, community, city, or country. And that's where I want to try and start from. First is that we need to look at how we reduce food waste. It's just as astonishing that an area larger than China is used to grow food that's never eaten. It is either left to rot in the ground or it is thrown away. And the sheer scale of food waste, it is a crisis of enormous proportions in itself. So we need global and local solutions that, first of all, address the waste that we currently either ignore or create and then throw away. And the other key big benefit in all this is that for every measure that we take in terms of reducing that waste, we will also be reducing the carbon emissions associated with it. And it allows us to take a different approach to how we restore and repair the soils upon which we grow things as well. It is going to have an impact on our diets, and you don't have to be a vegetarian to see that there are some tough choices that everyone is going to face if we all start to live within a reducing carbon budget. This carbon footprint of the food consumptions just would, if we had a carbon budget to work within and not just a financial budget, it's quite clear that many of us would have to start to reconfigure how we spent that carbon budget in order to get the maximum amount of nutritional value for ourselves and for our kids, and actually to live a healthier life at both a personal and a planetary level. We also have to reconfigure many of the priorities relating to our current approach to land use. One of the great absurdities in the UK is the notion that governments will subsidise biofuel production. But instead of doing that, we could free up the production of food for 3 million people at least, and lower food prices, just by shifting from the subsidies of things that are part of the problem to subsidizing alternative approaches that are part of the solution. And that's the reason we're not doing it is often because the key influences on national parliaments are often huge corporate interests, who in the case of the UK control, 8 companies control 90% of the UK food supply. And as a result, Britain produces just 50% of the food we eat. Why? Because the big companies are more obsessed with free trade agreements, exploiting other people's land and cheaper labour elsewhere, and they want the rights to undermine UK food production in order to deplete the resources and the soil standards of fertility in other parts of the planet in ways that then just trigger other crises that will eventually end up on our own shores anyway. But food currently makes up 25% of UK carbon emissions. And at some point, we have to acknowledge the responsibility for the fact that currently 2/3 of those emissions, our consumption emissions, are incurred producing food on other people's lands, not our own. However, the alternative to this, alternatives, are really exciting. And I want to run through some really good examples of where we might begin to look. In Liège, their Food Land Belt program aims to produce 50% of their food supply within the region within the coming 5 years. And that relocalization of food production systems isn't confined to Liège. Actually, you can find it probably at best in the European slow food movements in Terra Madre, which began in Italy, really seeking to prioritize the notion not only of food localities, but food accountability, shorter lines of food accountability that connect the consumer with the food producer, and which in the course of doing so can cut food miles, the carbon footprint of food miles, by up to 90%. The other thing that is exciting about this is the recognition that in terms of sustainable energy and sustainable food production, there isn't a conflict, there isn't an impossibility of combining renewable energy with sustainable food production as well. And the examples of Amansa in France just show that you can incorporate solar panels, solar energy generation in systems of agriculture as well. And it's not an either or. The key, which we'll come to look at in the next talk, is about whether that energy that is being generated is also part of a food and energy democracy, or whether it's yet again going to be hijacked by corporations whose interests are not really on sustainable food production, but sustainable profiteering. But the examples of localities and localization of sustainable systems can be found both north and south. And I was just intrigued by the fact that we're all caught up in the turbulence of torrential downpours. Whichever part of the planet you look at, you see examples of weather reporting where a month's rain has fallen in less than a day, and it absolutely washing away both livestock and seeds. And in this example in Bangladesh, where they recognize that those torrential downpours have the huge disruptive effects, and instead they've resorted to creating floating gardens, which will save their crops from floods. And although they can't stop the flooding, they can stop the crops from being washed away. In similar terms, there's been a real outbreak of inventiveness in terms of urban agriculture, from the examples of rooftop gardening in Barcelona to the urban network of food production in Sheffield and in Brighton and in Copenhagen and Montreal and Bath, and all across the planet. There are now fantastic examples of localized food production that will strengthen food accountability, strengthen our collective involvement in the process of understanding where our food comes from, and lower the carbon footprints that come with it, and restoring nature back into our towns and cities. And for me, one of the best examples is that of Lufa Farms in Montreal, where they commandeered the rooftops of factories, putting greenhouses on top of them, and using hydroponic agriculture to produce now in excess of 20,000 food trolleys a week. And we need to understand Montreal has winters, the like of which we don't really begin to understand in the UK. A metre or more of snow is perfectly normal. And so the question is, how do you deal with urban agriculture in extreme temperature variations? And Loofah Foods offer really good examples of how to do that. The fantastic thing for me is that already you see similar examples that have been picked up and copied in Paris, Berlin, Liège, and in the UK, in Scunthorpe, where we need to be looking and replicating the whole approach to particularly the use of hydroponic agriculture to produce and distribute food systems within our own localities. Going back to the Liège example, the key thing there is to see whether the subsidies that can be made should be directed via food cooperatives of farmers, in which that notion of collectivity of provision takes precedence over the current subsidies that are being offered to those who, the big 8 companies that dominate the current food supply systems. And Terra Madre and Paolo Petrini in Italy offer really good examples of how we share food practices. And in a time of changing climate conditions, where our weather patterns are being disrupted on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, what we're going to have to share is not so much produce, but the experience of managing disruptive climate conditions, which for many of us are going to come as an horrendous shock that we're going to have to deal with.